There's a number that most people don't understand, and once you cross it, your entire financial life changes in ways you probably never expected. That number is $20,000. I'm talking about $20,000 in your bank account, in actual savings that you've accumulated. Not income, not net worth. I mean real, liquid, usable money sitting in an account that you can access whenever you need it. Most people go their entire lives without ever reaching this number. And for those who do reach it, they often don't realize just how much having $20,000 actually changes everything about how you think, how you feel, and how you approach your life. I've spent the last 15 years studying people's financial journeys, and what I've discovered is that there are these critical thresholds where everything changes. Crossing them fundamentally alters your psychology, your options, your stress levels, and your ability to build wealth. $20,000 is one of the biggest thresholds, and it's actually bigger and more important than most people realize. If you're over 40 right now and you haven't hit this number yet, or if you just recently hit it, this video is going to change how you think about money and your financial journey. And if you've already crossed this threshold, you're going to understand why crossing it was such a big deal, and what you need to do differently now that you're on the other side of it. That's your friend, Clarence Capital. Don't forget, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's start with the most obvious thing. $20,000 gives you options. When you don't have this much money, you're basically trapped. You can't make choices about your life because you don't have the financial cushion to absorb a mistake or a crisis. If something goes wrong at your job, you can't afford to lose it because you need the paycheck. If an unexpected expense comes up, you're stressed because you don't have the cash to cover it. If you're unhappy in a situation, whether it's a job or a relationship or a living situation, you're stuck because you can't afford to make a change. Your life is controlled by circumstances because you don't have enough money to change those circumstances. But once you have $20,000, everything changes. Suddenly, you have options. You could leave your job if you wanted to and have enough money to survive for a few months while you found something better. You could handle an unexpected expense without going into a panic or going into debt. You could make choices based on what you actually want rather than what you're forced into by circumstances. That's huge. Most people don't realize how much of your stress and unhappiness comes simply from not having options. The second that you have $20,000 in the bank, your stress levels drop dramatically because you're no longer trapped. You have options, and having options changes everything about how you feel and how you operate in the world. The second thing that changes at $20,000 is your credit and your borrowing power. Once you have this much money, your credit score and your relationship with lending institutions fundamentally changes. You're no longer someone who needs to desperately borrow money. You're someone who has significant assets and could potentially borrow much larger amounts if you wanted to. Lenders look at people with $20,000 differently than they look at people with nothing. You're no longer high risk. You're no longer desperate. You become a more desirable customer to lenders, which means you get better interest rates on loans, better terms on credit cards, more options for financing, better offers for mortgages. This directly impacts your ability to make large financial moves, like buying a house or starting a business or making investments. Your borrowing power increases dramatically once you have $20,000 because you've proven that you can save, you can manage money, and you're not a financial disaster. Lenders want to work with you because you're profitable for them. The third thing is that your thinking about money fundamentally shifts. When you don't have $20,000, you're operating from a scarcity mindset. You're thinking about survival. You're thinking about the next paycheck. You're thinking about covering bills. You're constantly anxious about money. But once you have $20,000, your mindset shifts. You're no longer thinking about survival. You start thinking about growth. You start thinking about opportunity. You start thinking about the future instead of just worrying about next week. This is a psychological shift that's impossible to understand if you haven't experienced it, but it's absolutely real. People with money think differently about money than people without it. Once you cross the $20,000 threshold, you've proven to yourself that wealth building is actually possible. You've done it. You've saved $20,000, which means you can save more. You can build wealth. This confidence in your ability to actually accumulate money changes everything about how you approach financial decisions going forward. The fourth thing is that $20,000 gives you the ability to actually think about investing and wealth building instead of just survival. When you don't have this much money, you can't afford to invest. You need every dollar for bills and expenses. But once you have $20,000, you have a foundation. You have something to build on. You can now start thinking about investing some of that money, which means you can start earning money on top of your income. You can put money into the stock market. You can invest in real estate. You can start a side business. You have options for actually building wealth rather than just earning a paycheck. This is critical because this is where wealth building actually starts. As long as you're only earning income, you're limited by how many hours you can work. But once you start investing, your money starts earning money for you. And that's when real wealth building begins. $20,000 is the threshold where wealth building becomes possible. The fifth thing is something that most people completely overlook. $20,000 changes your relationship with risk and opportunity. When you don't have $20,000, you can't afford to take risks. You have to play it safe, because if something goes wrong, you don't have a cushion. But once you have $20,000, you can actually afford to take some risks, because you have a safety net. You could pursue a business opportunity that might not work out, because if it fails, you still have $20,000. You could negotiate harder for a raise or a better position, because you have money in the bank and you're not desperate. You could potentially invest in something with higher risk and higher potential reward, because you have assets to cushion a loss. This ability to take calculated risks is actually what separates people who build massive wealth from people who stay broke their entire lives. Poor people can't take risks because they can't afford to fail. Wealthy people take calculated risks because they have the financial cushion to absorb failure if it happens. $20,000 gives you that cushion for the first time. Now, here's what's really important and what most people completely miss. Once you hit $20,000, everything gets exponentially harder and more important going forward. This is the critical part that changes everything. Reaching $20,000 is actually relatively straightforward because the amount is small enough that you can save it from a normal job over a few years. You can do it while working a regular job and living a normal life. You're just being disciplined with your money for a few years, and you get to $20,000. But here's where it gets hard. Most people hit $20,000, and then they stop. They get comfortable. They think they've made it. They've got their emergency fund. They've got their cushion. And then they spend it. Or they stagnate at that level because they don't understand that $20,000 is not the finish line. It's the starting line. It's the threshold where the game actually changes and gets harder. The reason it gets harder is that $20,000 is still not enough to generate significant income on its own. If you put $20,000 in the stock market, earning 5% per year, You're making $1,000 a year. That's not enough to live on. That's a supplement to your income, but it's not a replacement. You're still dependent on your job. You're still limited by how many hours you can work. You still need to be actively earning money. But here's the thing. Most people don't realize that they need to keep pushing after $20,000. They think they've solved the problem and they can relax. But the problem isn't solved. You're just getting started. You need to keep saving and investing. You need to get to $50,000, then $100,000, then $250,000, then $1 million. These are the thresholds where your life actually transforms. 20,000 is just the first one. The critical part that changes after $20,000 is that you have to be way more intentional and strategic about how you use that money. When you're trying to get to $20,000, you can be pretty simple about it. Earn money, save money, don't spend it. That works. But once you have $20,000, you need a strategy. You need to understand the difference between using that money as an emergency fund and using it as an investment. You need to understand asset allocation. You need to understand how to make your money work for you. You need to understand the power of compound interest. You need to understand opportunity cost. You need to be strategic about every financial decision because now you have something to lose, and you're trying to build it into something bigger. Most people don't develop these skills, which is why most people never get past $20,000. The other thing that changes after $20,000 is that you have to be way more careful about what you spend your money on. When you don't have any money, you're not buying much of anything anyway. You're focused on bills and survival. But once you have $20,000, you have the ability to spend money on things. And here's where people get destroyed. They get to $20,000, and then they spend it. They think they've made it, so they buy a new car. They take a vacation. They upgrade their lifestyle. They spend the money they accumulated, and they're back to zero. The money is gone, and so is the psychological benefit and the financial foundation they built. This is incredibly common. Most people don't have the discipline to keep the money once they get it. The change after $20,000 is that you have to have way more discipline and way more focus on not just earning money and saving money, but on actually growing that money strategically. Here's something else that really changes after $20,000. Your goals need to shift. Before $20,000, your goal is straightforward. Save $20,000. It's simple. It's concrete. You know exactly what you're working toward. But once you hit it, your goal becomes much less clear. A lot of people hit $20,000 and they don't know what to do next. They don't have a clear goal, so they lose focus. They stop being disciplined. The money sits there or gets spent. But people who actually keep building wealth after $20,000 have a clear next goal. Maybe it's $50,000. Maybe it's getting to a point where they're making $10,000 a year passively from investments. Maybe it's starting a business that generates income. They have a specific goal they're working toward. Without that goal, you lose momentum and you stagnate. The fourth major change after $20,000 is that the way you think about your career changes. Before $20,000, you're probably thinking about your job as your only source of income. That's your focus. That's where all your money comes from. You need that job to survive. But once you have $20,000, you can start thinking about your career differently. You can think about whether your current job is actually the best use of your time and skills. You can think about whether you should be investing in additional education or training to increase your earning potential. You can think about whether you should be using some of your money to start a side business. You can think about negotiating a raise or switching to a better job because you have a cushion and you're not desperate. $20,000 gives you the freedom to strategically think about your earning potential instead of just accepting whatever job you have. Now, let's talk about what actually needs to change after you hit $20,000 if you want to keep building wealth. First, you need to stop thinking of that money as just an emergency fund. Yes, you should have an emergency fund. But once you have $20,000, you should have a portion of that as emergency savings and a portion of that as investment capital. You need to understand the difference and make intentional choices about how much is emergency fund and how much is investment money. Second, you need to have a clear strategy for growing that money beyond just saving more. You could save another $20,000, but that takes years. Or you could invest the $20,000 and get it to grow through compound interest while you're saving additional money. The combination of saving and investing is what actually builds wealth fast. Third, you need to be way more strategic about your spending. Not in a restrictive way, but in a focused way. You need to understand where your money is going and make intentional decisions about whether that spending is moving you toward your goals or away from them. Fourth, after $20,000, you need to start learning about different investment vehicles and strategies. When you don't have money, there's not much point in learning about investing because you don't have anything to invest. But once you have $20,000, it becomes critical. You need to understand stocks and bonds and real estate and business opportunities. You need to understand risk and return. You need to develop an investment strategy that matches your goals and your risk tolerance. This is where a lot of people get stuck because they think investing is too complicated. But it's not. There are simple strategies that work. You just need to learn them. Fifth, after $20,000, you need to think about your financial identity and your relationship with money. The fact that you've saved this much money means you have discipline. You have the ability to delay gratification. You have the ability to stick to a plan. But a lot of people don't recognize this about themselves. They still see themselves as someone who doesn't have money. They still operate from a scarcity mindset, even though they've proven they can save. The mental shift to see yourself as someone who builds wealth is critical if you want to keep building. Here's something that's really important. The biggest mistake people make after $20,000 is they think their financial problems are solved. They think they can relax and go back to normal. But $20,000 is not a finish line. It's not the end of the game. It's the point where the game actually gets serious. It's the point where you have to be intentional about what you do next. It's the point where your decisions matter way more because you have something to lose and you're trying to build it into something bigger. Most people don't understand this, which is why most people never make it past $20,000. They hit it, and then they either spend it or they stagnate because they don't have a clear strategy for what comes next. If you're over 40 right now and you don't have $20,000 yet, this should be your number one priority. This is not some distant goal that you work on casually. This is the foundation of everything. Get to $20,000. Save it. Build it. Don't spend it. Once you have it, you have options. You have a foundation. You have the ability to start building wealth. But if you don't have it, you're stuck. You're limited. You're trapped by circumstances. Everything changes once you hit $20,000. It's that important. The second thing is that if you already have $20,000, You need to understand what I've talked about in this video. You're not done. You're just getting started. You need to have a strategy for growing that money. You need to be intentional about your next moves. You need to keep your discipline. You need to level up your financial knowledge and your financial strategy, because the game just got harder and more serious. The path to wealth is not smooth. There are thresholds where things change and get harder. $20,000 is one of the most important ones, because it's the point where you go from barely surviving to actually having options. It's the point where you go from just earning a paycheck to being able to invest and build wealth. It's the point where the game changes from easy to hard. Most people don't make it past this point because they don't understand that the rules change. But now you understand. You understand that hitting $20,000 changes everything. You understand that the things that work for getting to $20,000 don't work for getting beyond $20,000. You understand that you have to be more strategic, more intentional, and more disciplined once you cross this threshold. And you understand that this threshold is just the beginning. There are more thresholds ahead. $50,000, $100,000, $1 million. Each one gets harder. Each one requires more knowledge and more strategy. But each one also opens up more possibilities and more options for how you can live your life. The most important thing I want you to take away from this video is that reaching $20,000 is a huge accomplishment that should be celebrated. You've proven to yourself that you can save money. You've proven that you can stick to a plan. You've proven that you can build wealth. Those are huge things. But don't stop there. Don't let that be your finish line. Use $20,000 as your launching point. Use it as your foundation. Use it as your proof that you can build wealth. And then push forward. Keep building, keep saving, keep investing, keep learning. Because the thresholds keep going up. But with each one you cross, your life gets more and more under your control and more aligned with what you actually want. That's what wealth building is really about. It's not about being rich. It's about having options. It's about being in control of your own life. It's about being able to make choices based on what you want rather than being forced into choices by circumstances. And that starts with $20,000. That's the threshold. That's the line you need to cross. If you haven't crossed it yet, make that your goal. Get to $20,000. And then, once you're there, we'll talk about what comes next. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helped you understand why $20,000 is such a critical number in your financial journey. If you found this valuable, please like and subscribe to Clarence Capital, because we talk about this stuff constantly. We break down the psychological and practical aspects of money and wealth building. We talk about the thresholds and the milestones and what changes at each point in your financial journey. We talk about the reality of building wealth, not the fantasy version that gets sold by gurus and people on the internet. That's what we do, and I really appreciate your support. Now go start working toward that $20,000. Or, if you already have it, go start working toward the next threshold. Your financial freedom is waiting on the other side.